In this movie, I want to show you a couple more features of the walls specifically, but I also want to talk about a more generic concept of the difference between an instance property and a type property. So we'll be using walls as the backdrop for that conversation, and in the process, we'll be exposing a couple of these other features of walls that we haven't yet looked at. So the first thing will be the location line of the wall. Now, the location line of the wall is an instance property. So let's start with what we mean by an instance property. An instance property means that even though you make the change only affects the object you actually have selected. So even if 2 or 3 or 4 other objects had the same property, unless you select those objects, they won't be changed. A type property, on the other hand, doesn't matter what's selected. All the elements that share that type, if you make a change to the type, it applies globally across all instances of the type. So again, let's look a little bit at the location line. Now, to help us do that, I've added a small segment of wall here, and this is just the wall type called exterior brick on CMU, and it's just one of the included wall types in the template. It's got a layer of brick, it's got an air gap, some insulation, some CMU, and then some finished layers on the inside face with some drywall. When you create a wall, there's a series of properties over here on the properties palette. Anything that's directly here on the properties palette is an instance property. In previous movies, we looked at the base constraint and the top constraint, which controlled the height of the wall. And we saw there that each wall could have its own individual height. Those were examples of instance properties. Well, the one that we skipped over was the location line here at the top. And what you'll see is that there's actually 6 choices. So I've annotated those 6 choices here just with some line work and some text. So on the far left, we have the finish face exterior. On the far right, we have the finish face interior. And I think those are pretty self-explanatory, as is the wall center line, which is right down the geometric center of the wall. The 3 red lines indicate where the core of the wall is. And it again has a center, an interior, and an exterior. So what exactly is the core? The core of the wall is the part of the wall that actually holds the wall up. So just think of it that way. So it's really the structural component in the wall. So every wall has to have some sort of structure that actually supports the wall itself. In this case, the CMU is what's holding up the wall, and then the drywall is a finish on the inside, and the brick and insulation is a veneer on the outside. But neither of those things are structural. They're not actually supporting the wall. Only the CMU is doing that job. Now, that's an instance property, and that's the location line. But to really understand the location line fully, let's go to a different view. So I've got a view over here called wall types, and I'm going to open that up. And I've got the same wall 4 times. So all 4 of these instances are that same brick on CMU wall type. What I want to do here is, if you select it, you'll notice that these small little grip points indicating where the current location line is. And what I want to do here is change the location line of each of these walls. So this one's currently wall center line, and I'll change it to core center line. And this one is currently wall center line, and I'll do finish face exterior. And I'll make this one finish face interior, and I'll do this one at the core face interior. Now, the only change you're going to see is that those grip points shift within the wall itself. Notice that these have shifted over here, and these have shifted all the way over here. Now, the other thing you'll notice if you look carefully is these walls are going the wrong way. The brick is actually on the inside of the building as opposed to the outside of the building, which would make for a rather odd condition. So what we want to do next is select one of these walls and notice that there's a small flip grip on the wall. Now, if you click that grip, it will flip the orientation of the wall and move the brick to the outside. But notice the way that it's going to do that. Did you see how it flipped around those grip points? Or in other words, it flipped around the location line. So each time you flip one of these walls, it's actually the location line that's determining where the center of that flip behavior ought to be. So the location line stays put, and then the wall changes around it. Now, the other place where the location line is important is if you change the type of wall that you're using, or in other words, change the thickness of the wall. So if I scroll down here and choose a wall that's much thinner, like this interior 4 7/8 inch partition, notice that that wall gets considerably smaller, but it maintained the location line on the inside face of the core. So the location line controls those 2 things, where it flips and what point stays put when you change the thickness of the wall. So it's important to keep those in mind, but it's also important to remember that that's an instance-based property. When I change this wall to another type or another location line, it only affected this wall. So now let's look at an example of a type-based property. To get to a type-based property, I'm going to select one of these brick masonry walls that I still have, and I'll click the Edit Type button here on the Properties palette. And that, of course, gets me to the Type Properties window where I can modify the properties of this type. Now, there's a couple things that we could do here. If you scroll through this list, you're going to see that there's all sorts of settings, but really the stuff that you're actually seeing in the wall, where the composition of the wall comes in, is all here under this Edit Structure button. So I'm going to click that next. Now, it's a little difficult to read everything that's going on here, so let me just widen this window a little bit so that that makes everything a little more legible. And what you're going to see is that a layered wall is made up of a series of layers that are all sort of sandwiched together. The core boundary here and here indicates the boundary line between the core and the finishes. Notice that at the top it says exterior side, and at the bottom it says interior side. So the layers above the core here are the exterior finishes. The layers below the core here are the interior finishes. So let's say for this example that I wanted to do something rather dramatic. And I'm going to take the substrate layer and delete it, and the finish layer and also delete it. So I've removed all the finishes. I'm going to have raw exposed CMU on the inside of the building. When I click OK, I want you to watch what happens to this wall, and this wall. Even though this is the only one that's selected, notice that this change will apply to all three walls. That's what we mean by a type level modification. Now, another example of a type level modification that would be graphically noticeable would be the coarse scale fill pattern. Now, we're currently set to medium detail, so we're not going to see the coarse scale fill pattern. So let me change this to coarse, and that's going to display just the outlines of the walls. But then I'm going to select one of those walls again and go back to Edit Type, and the coarse scale fill pattern is here in the middle. I'm going to click in the fill pattern field, click the Browse button, and change that to a solid fill pattern. And then I'm going to click the black color here and change it to something a little bit less dramatic, like maybe this purple color here, and click OK. And now you'll see that that change applies to all three instances. So it's yet another example of doing a type level modification. So remember, instance level modifications like modifying the location line affect each individual wall. So if you want to change the location line of several walls, you'd have to select them first to change them. Where a type level modification affects all the walls of that same type regardless of whether or not they're selected. And as we progress with our work in Revit, we're going to see this notion of the difference between instance and type level properties is going to be a very common one that we're going to encounter quite a bit.